We are in, as you can see, part 2 of the archaeology of rural life in the Roman world. And Maggie ten Berge is our presenter. And she is a Roman archaeologist and economic historian. She graduated last year from the University of Oxford, England, where she did her PhD in classical archaeology. Her dissertation is, I keep dropping this down, and I know that doesn't work. It's got to be up here. Her dissertation is Living Standards and Market Integration in the Rural Economy of Roman Britain. She's revising that dissertation into her first book, and which will be published by the University of Michigan Press. She is currently a visiting assistant professor at Hope College, but she'll be starting a new position as an assistant professor, I assume tenure track, of classics at Grand Valley State University in August. So that's a good deal. So I think that's all I'll do. I'll do a short introduction. You heard the long one last week, so take it away.
Hi, everybody. That feels a little loud. Is that? Okay. Hi, how are you all doing? Good. I put a few slides on for introduction in case there were new people, but I'm not going to talk about them since I don't know. Are there new people? Okay. Well, your neighbors can fill you in. This is my daughter. This is an excavation. I guess I'm filling you in. Me and my husband at my graduation. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to review what we did last week really briefly. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the theoretical models, but like not a lot, just a little bit more, because I want to make sure that we have time. So we'll talk about this a little. And then I'm going to introduce you to my project that I did my dissertation on, and then I'm writing my book about. And I'm going to probably, if we have time, have you do a mapping exercise, not where you're making a map, but where I'm telling you, you know how to read a map already, but we're going to be practicing how do you get a lot of extra information from a map? Yep. I teach them no, like they come in not knowing how to read a map. Yeah. Even when I started, so I have to make maps as part of my dissertation work and my book work. But one of my supervisor once said, well, you need to go get this map and it's in this library. And I got it. And I said, what do I do with it now? And yeah. And I'm like significantly older than these students, but had never used a non-digital map in any way before, like since I was 10. Yeah. So yeah. Interesting. We'll be talking about two of my case studies, one of them at really great length and one of them really briefly. And then we'll talk about the conclusions. Okay. So just to remind you, we're in the Roman Empire. And we remember that the Romans start settling in the area around Rome around 1000, maybe 1200 BC. And slowly around 500 BC, they start to become a republic. And around that time, they start to slowly conquer the places in Italy right around Rome. And they slowly expand, eventually taking over the entire Mediterranean and then North Africa, all the way to the Red Sea. Some people will put this all the way out to the Persian Gulf, others will not. And then all the way up into Britain, right at the border with Britain, between England and Scotland today. We talked about how the Romans see themselves as an urban people, and they have very highly developed urban infrastructure. But what we don't quite understand at this point, and one of the things that I'm working on is trying to understand how the rural population engaged with the urban population and what their economic and social lives were like outside of this. Just for people that weren't, the person that wasn't here, and the rest of you to remind you all, this Roman population, urban and rural combined, was about 70 million people at any one time. They lived over an area of around 2 million square miles. And they were really highly connected. They had the fastest growing and most robust economy in history until the Industrial Revolution, okay? Part of the reason for the growth of that economy was the need to supply the army, which was stationed, let's go back to this, well, we can do it on this map, all along the boundaries of the empire. There were forts and the army was permanently stationed at those forts. There were also troops that moved around the empire. So there was a large number of troops deployed all the time and a need to supply them. There were also very large cities like the city of Rome with over 1 million people in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, okay? So this is part of the reason for the growth of the economy. Another reason for the growth of the economy that I argue in my research is that we have a change in kind of the ethos for regular people seem to want to be consumers in a different way than they had wanted to before. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that at the end of today's class. So just keep that in your mind, like consumers, maybe in addition to being producers. So this is just a slide to remind you of some of the scale of production in urban centers in the Roman world. And in the rural world here, we see this map showing us rural production centers for the olive oil that winds up in Rome. So what is happening in the countryside? We know people are living in the cities. We know, though, that 70 to 90% of the population lives in the countryside. And we have major questions about what their lives were like and even who they were. So this is where we kind of left it last time. We were sort of talking about what are our stereotypes about rural people, right? We lack a lot of the basic data that we want to have about who the rural population was. We don't know how much money they made, how many people lived where, how big the farms were, how many people lived on the farms, what they paid in taxes, how many people were rich versus how many people were poor versus how many people were enslaved. None of that, we know none of that information. So we wonder, and one of the things that I realized when I started doing my dissertation, and I kind of touched on this last time, I was trying to figure out, like, in the research, they call the rural population peasant some of the time, and sometimes subsistence farmers, okay? Tenants, subsistence farmers, or peasants, okay? Peasant tenants, peasant subsistence farmers. Where do we get that idea? Why do we think that? Those things mean different things. We're going to talk about them in a minute. Those different words might have different sort of theoretical assumptions behind them. Why do we have those assumptions? I started looking through all of the research, trying to figure out, like, why do we think they lived at subsistence? Do you guys know, what does subsistence mean if we say somebody lived at subsistence? They produced enough for survival and usually not anything more is what we're assuming when we say somebody lived at subsistence. We might say we're going to make an economic model assuming that people lived at 1.2% of subsistence because they have to store stuff for next year, right? But why would we think that people would only farm as much as they needed for subsistence? I didn't know why. So I tried to look back and back and back and back through all the publications, trying to find, like, here's our source, our Roman source or our medieval source, talking about how much people were able to grow on their farms. We know that sometimes farms were very small. In those cases, yes, people did live only at subsistence, usually below subsistence, and then they would hire out their own labor to try to make enough money to buy enough food to survive. But where we don't know farm size, how can we tell that people are only living at subsistence? What I found was just a lot of stereotypes. And this is when I said last time, and I always tell this to people, like, I cried every day as I did this research because I found, and I'll show you, this is stuff that I haven't shown you yet. What happens is you go back through the economic literature and then you wind up finding yourself in non-economic literature, really in discussions of the medieval economy that talk about peasants from the perspective of the landlords. And the word peasant, it comes from Latin, the people that live in the countryside, really like Latin into French into into English. The word peasant in French, though, is villain, a villain. And yeah, that's where we get our word villain from. Villain just means the people of the villa, right? The people that live in the countryside, the people of the villa. But when they use it in medieval French, they're talking about peasants, and they mean they say some are like animals, pig-like peasants, dog-like peasants, ass-like peasants. Others are merely ferocious, vilain ramage, okay? In medieval German, the word peasant means rustic, devil, robber, brigand, and looter. And in medieval English, the verb to peasant meant to subjugate someone. So I'm going to peasant her or him. To subjugate them as a peasant is subjugated. Because remember what we talked about last time, peasants are legally at a lower status than the rest of the population for a very, very, very long time, ending in around 13 to 1400 in different places in Europe. And in some places up until the 1800s, right? In Russia, we know peasants were serfs in serfs, which is basically enslaved until the 1800s. In Dutch, so my husband is Dutch, so I know a lot of Dutch. And he's, he'll always tease our daughter will burp and he'll say like, niet boeren. Don't be such a farmer. Don't burp like that. Okay. Again, not a great way of thinking about the rural population, in my opinion. So we have all of this literary, with lots and lots and lots. We could spend, there's a 500-page book that I found about this when I was first doing my research that only talks about stereotypes from the literary perspective, and it's just scratching the surface. So if you're interested, come and talk to me. I'll point you in the right direction. It's a great book. This is a painting from a little book of hours. You know what books of hours are? Little prayer books, right? This is from, we know, was painted between 1412 and 1416 by two brothers, right? And it was for a wealthy landowning elite person. And it shows, it's a book of hours that goes through all of the months of the year, right? And here we have the month of February. And I'd like you to just talk to your neighbor about what you see and whether or not this is a positive or negative depiction of peasants for like 1 to 2 minutes. Go. All right. I've heard lots of interesting things wafting over. What are we thinking? This is too loud. Yeah. Here, wait till you get the microphone. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the people in the blue clothing are not peasants, because where would they get blue clothing?
So they are peasants.
And why? How did they get blue dresses? Are they working in the house or something? Why do they have nicer clothes?
Maybe they are, but one way or the other, it's an very interesting observation. Very interesting observation.
To the two of us, they looked reasonably prosperous. They have, roofs over their sheep. It looks like they have beehives. The guy can afford a donkey to transport his goods. Looks like some random birds are eating leftover seeds. So to us, it looked like they were at least modestly prosperous. So maybe they could afford blue dresses. So
They didn't have coats on and it's cold outside.
He has a coat, so like this guy has a coat, but the rest of them don't. No, you're right. It's cold. What are the people doing in the house? Yeah, go ahead.
Going to say that none of them seems to be doing heavy labor.
No, except this dude. Okay, this one maybe cutting wood. I can't really see it that.
Golfing.
It looks a little bit. So, yeah,
Where are we?
I think from my perspective, and you see it as I see it as an artist, is that you're carrying those colors over 3 times and it's
Yeah.
like a triangle. So that's how I see it.
it could be. I mean, it can't be so unrealistic that the viewer would think, oh, somebody would never wear that color, right? So maybe people had, I mean, we do, it's blue could be really expensive in wall paint in the medieval world and certainly in the Roman world. But blue for clothing dye doesn't have to be as expensive as blue paint does. So it's possible, right? Very, very likely that people wore multicolored clothing. Yes.
We were trying to translate the title, but my high school French and I don't know that Ron's was much better. We weren't sure we were right. So what does les très riches?
No, the very rich hours of the Duc de
Oh.
Berge, who is just a duke, a very, very wealthy, powerful landowning elite in France. And so the very nicely done Book of Hours. Yes.
And I wondered if it was because of the person commissioning the painting, he wanted to show how well his peasants actually lived.
Yes. Yes. It's very possible. These are his peasants living on his land in presumably his own buildings that he owns himself, right? They're paying a rent on this building. And they may even, they may own their farm animals and they may not, right? And I don't know the situation in France as well as I know what the situation was in England, where people would own their own farm animals, but they didn't own their own land. And they would pay, and it would be different in every different community with different tenancy agreements in every community. One thing that we could say here, okay, is this is not the image that maybe many of us have of a small mud hut with everybody wearing rags, right? Whether or not that is realistic is another question. And I think it is, and I'll tell you why in a second. But another thing that you're not seeing because you're not a medieval person is that this is actually a very negative depiction of peasants, okay? And it's making an assertion about peasants that we see over and over again. And I'm just going to show you 2 images, okay? So this one and another one. Do you see the woman in the blue? Do you see that you can see her legs? Almost not quite up to the knee, but you can see her calves. And this is not how women are supposed to dress and show themselves in the medieval world. Women are supposed to be covered from, neck to foot and oftentimes wearing a headdress, which this woman is, but we can see her legs and we can see her undergarments, right? So imagine a picture. I mean, it would take a lot more undress in the modern world to make the same claim about a person, but we've all seen those pictures of like the hillbilly pictures with the man with his belly hanging out, right? That's not a positive depiction, right? It's making an assertion that medieval landlords make over and over again in their literature that peasants are sinful.
Well, look at the 2 women. Are you going to talk about them? The 2 women inside the shed?
Well, I'm talking first about this one.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
then about these,
Two.
one of them is a man, and I think this one is a
Oh.
man too. But again, they're sitting with their knees hanging out and their clothing hold up. This one might be a woman, the one in the blue, and the one in the middle is a man.
Oh. yeah.
And their legs are hanging out, right? And their dress is hiked up or tunics hiked up to above the knee, right? It's not, it's their house and they're warming their legs by the fire, trying to warm up. But it's not a depiction of people who are doing just what they should be doing, medieval women, you know, sitting completely covered. Yeah. You want to?
Far away.
Yeah.
Oh.
Was the depiction supposed to be it says for February,
Mhm.
was it supposed to be warning about being slothful? Or,
Yeah.
if you saw the whole thing where there are different messages sent to remind people not to be gluttonous, not to be lustful. What is it? It was, I assume, written with a message as well as just a depiction.
Well, it's not a message for them. Okay. It's a message for the owner of this estate.
The
So
commissioner.
maybe it is. I mean, people have different opinions about this. Is it just supposed to be a beautiful picture and we see ideologies creeping in the way that people depict people? Or is it supposed to be warning us? When I look through these particular images, I'll say it seems to be showing us the kind of work that goes on the estate in the different months. Whether or not, and they're not, all of the depictions aren't equally negative, right? This one, and maybe it's not intentionally negative here, right? But we never see elite women depicted with their legs showing. We never see elite men depicted with their knees hanging out, right? So what I think is that it's an unintentional, not attempting to moralize, but we're going to see in a second, there is a moralizing image that I'm going to show you next, which is very overtly intended to make this same argument. And we can just go there now. Okay, this is Peter Bruegel, The Peasant Dance from 1567, a little bit later, okay? And this is, Bruegel is known for being very moralizing in his art. And here, again, it's hard for our eyes to really understand what some of the conventions that are being broken are. So again, I'd like you to talk to each other just for a minute about what can you see? Can you see maybe like some of the deadly sins? You know what they are, right? 7 deadly sins. Do you see any of them here? Go.
I see something in between the lights.
Yeah. I always, and this is only a small part of my research, but I always really wanted to go actually look at the image because I can't ever zoom in enough to see what we can really see. And then this, well, I'm not gonna move away from it. It was painted by these 2 brothers and then they died, they and the person that commissioned it all died. And then it was repainted and made into the book by later people. So that again, and not the later. Right, so it just adds more interest. We do have it. I mean, no, we don't have the original. No, it's just been, because it wasn't finished when they died. So somebody, maybe like 40 years later, finished it and made it into a book. And then 100 years later, somebody else worked it up again. And that book is in Sean's Smith, and then we're going to print that. But I really, well, it's a minor part of your work. Right. Not worth like changing a family vacation for, but if we were gonna be there, I would go see it. Yeah, because it's really cool.
I just saw the woman.
Okay. So a couple ideas. Do we have ideas?
I was going to try that. This is somewhere around the Reformation, and this is peasants doing what they've done for centuries, having fun, and the leaves are on the trees. It might be some kind of May Day or celebrations, but the church wants them to behave.
Well, so there's a huge anti-Catholic bias in a lot of these paintings showing Catholic it's always the peasants are Catholic oftentimes, and the wealthier landlords have converted already, and they're showing, and in this case we see here an image of the Virgin Mary hanging on the tree. But the people aren't being properly religious, right? I'm from Massachusetts, where we have Plymouth Plantation. And when I was a kid, we would always go to Plymouth Plantation and learn that the Pilgrims, when they came here, they weren't even allowed to celebrate Christmas. Not any, they could get, I don't remember what the punishment was. I think it was you have to leave the community for a few days or something ridiculous for celebrating, for being found out for having a special meal at Christmas. Okay. So it's this kind of, what? Well, yeah.
According to some.
So yes, they're celebrating, they're having fun, they're ignoring whatever the holiness of the day is supposed to be. Having too much fun, yes.
I was just going to say that coming from French Canadian peasant stock, this just looks like my family on a holiday.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's like the dancing, the playing cards, the drinking. Sometimes some people get carried away, not always, but it also kind of is indicative that wherever the French or the Roman Catholic culture was, these people were frowned upon, not just the French Catholics in Canada, but also the Irish and all the places where people actually had fun.
Yeah. Yes. We'll have another slide about that in a second. We can see people having fun, drinking, right, in excess, maybe. Gluttony, because maybe they're eating too much. They're certainly drinking too much, which is gluttony, okay? Sloth, they're kind of sitting there just talking. They're not properly praying, right? Sitting around talking. Lust back here. This looks pretty tame to us, right? But to viewers living in the 16th century, it's whoa, a woman and a man kissing in public. That's not something that would be appropriate for a painting in any case, right? Yeah. Somebody pulling this man into her house, right? Lots of dancing, men and women holding hands. I don't see anybody pulling up their dresses or anything like that, like we saw in the previous one. But still what we're seeing is a depiction of peasants, right? In some ways, what we see is we're obviously not seeing a subsistence-based society here. People have stuff. They're wearing nicely dyed clothing. To what extent this is partly just for the composition and to what extent it's realistic, we don't really know, or at least I don't really know because I don't specialize in medieval clothing. I know that there are pieces of medieval clothing that survive, but they tend to be elite clothing. So exactly how many people would have had clothing with dye in a regular everyday village, I don't know the answer to that. But we certainly see people with a knife, knives, bagpipes, they're not living in rags in a hut, in a hovel, right? We have houses. nice-ish houses, right? This is very realistic. So something really interesting that I found when I was doing my research is it's the estate records of a man that died around the town of Cambridge, right? Lived around the town of Cambridge, city of Cambridge, I guess, in the 1400s. Okay, he was born as a serf, but he died as a free man because he's living in this time when serfdom is starting to collapse. And this is the record of his own household and the things that they owned when he died. And he was a wealthier man. He sent one of his sons to Cambridge. So he started out as a serf, gained probably a lot more wealth than most of the people in his community. But what you learn when you read his records is that he and his wife ran a beer brewing business. Well, his wife ran the beer brewing business. He was a farmer, but he, unlike some of the other people who didn't take a ton of risk, he became the tenant of a lot more land than he needed to, than he could have, taking on an enormous amount of risk and reaping a big reward. He lived in a nice house in the village, but so did many of the others. And this record talks about how he and his wife sold beer to the rest of the village, and sometimes in exchange for things that other villagers made. Okay, so we're seeing the economy of a small village where we have people making things for sale to other people for money, sometimes bartering, but oftentimes selling for cash. And he owned quite a lot of things, a lot of fancy pottery, a lot of fine clothing, a couple beds, living in a nice 2-story house, right? That I don't think still survives. I tried to find it. I don't know. This is not my area of specialty. So I did this as sort of a side thing, trying to see, what is really a realistic depiction of peasants in the medieval period versus what we think. Our image of peasants in the medieval period comes really from Northern Europe, predominantly Ireland in the potato famine, right? That's the pictures that we often get are the very, very worst of the worst. And here, this is the one I was telling you about. 2 points about this. Point number one, and this is something that I've seen in all of the literature that I've read about this. So why are the depictions of peasants so overwhelmingly negative, the ones that we can read about? First of all, it makes sense that if a landlord is the one that is making the depiction or, causing the depiction to be made, he's going to want to feel like he's the owner of the land for a reason, right? So we see this spelled out in a really, really clear way in some of the later treatises on farming, that the rural population, they're too conservative. They don't work hard enough. They really need a father figure. I'm the father figure. I own all the land. I charge them too much money in rent. I'm not going to sell them any of the land because they really need somebody to make sure that they're making the good decisions. They have a tendency to have too many kids, to drink too much, to do everything wrong. Okay. Earlier medieval depictions more talk about sin instead of talking about stupidity, right? But it's the same kind of a thing. And this is just, we know that in Ireland, so some of our depictions from Ireland that are so negative, they come from a time when Irish Catholic peasants were not allowed to own land, really. They had to rent land, and it had to be just the very, very, very smallest amount of land possible. So of course they're living at a level that makes it look like they're living in a mud. I mean, they are living in a mud hut. They are only farming enough to survive, if that. They're only able to really farm potatoes because potatoes have the most calorie per acre, right? That does well in this particular soil in Ireland, right? And so when there's a potato blight, they're all dying. But that's not because peasants are lazy. That's because these people in this cultural moment are prevented from actually doing anything to better themselves, right? So this is where I wound up. You can read this. In the first year of my dissertation. We saw similar things in this country under slavery, right? We're all familiar with that. This is a similar idea. So what I wound up with was thinking, okay, so some of the stereotypes that we have they've made their way into economic literature, right? Because they're still around in the 1800s when people like Malthus start writing, right? They're still there. Peasants are still there. So what can we say about the Romans? Can we really responsibly take the ideas that come from this kind of a situation and just assume that they're true and bring them into our studies of a different population at an earlier time? Maybe it is true. I mean, but we don't know. And so what I started out with was trying to figure out, how can I look at this question with as few biases as possible, so that I can try not to bring some of this baggage with me into the research, because it is there. Here, another one. This one I wasn't sure if I should put on because it's so disturbing. This is Balzac, French playwright and an author, writing about the need to get peasants off the land in France in the 1800s, privatizing land ownership. Anyway, our theories about peasants or rural populations in the Roman world start off, and they're changing a little bit now, but certainly at the time when I started doing the research, assumed that these stereotypes were true. People are living at subsistence, really only at subsistence, that they're economically irrational. What does that mean? It just means that they're not trying to make a profit. They're actually not trying not to make a profit, but that they really are lazy is one of the things that you actually see in the literature, that they would only work as much as they needed to and then stop, as much as they needed to survive and then stop. Okay. And this is the sort of the visual of the economic model that exists in our field today, is that there might be villa owners who are selling their produce to markets, and that there are then the rest of the population, the 70 to 90% of the population, who are living on the bulk of the land and doing the bulk of the farming, paying some of their produce in rent, and maybe that is what's funding the cities, but who are living at subsistence. And this is the question that I have, is this true or not? One of the reasons why I care about whether or not it's true is that as an archaeologist, I want to be able to excavate and learn about peasant communities. But because of this theory, there are a lot of people that think that I'm going to go forward for a second. There are people that think that you can't excavate rural communities and actually find the people that live there. So this is kind of a hard one to understand if you don't know all of the archaeological jargon. So what this person is saying in 2009, these two people saying artifacts such as small farms that archaeologists may have found. So archaeologists always writing articles saying like, oh, I found this small farm. Let's talk about all these things that the farmers were doing. Walter Scheidel and Stephen Friesen saying, well, these putative small farms are most likely to derive from the more robust elements of the middling income tier. Because most of what the subtext is, they're doing more than subsistence farming if you can find them. Therefore, everybody that we can find is not a subsistence farmer. Therefore, they can't be the peasants that we're really looking for. Which I don't know about you, but I think it's a very circular argument, right? Are you asking? Yeah.
Once you get this mud hut, is the theory that once you get low enough, you don't have much that's durable.
Exactly.
So, if you live in a mud hut, a rain, you don't have a house. You live in a stone house, you're upscale, but it's still around, at least in shambles,
Right.
hundreds of years later.
Exactly. So this is the idea that people that were living at a low level would have lived in mud huts that we can't find, would have used wood instead of ceramic that we can't find. The problem is, so I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to show you some of the archaeology, okay? Problem is that we can find those things. And we do, and we have. So, okay. There are lots of people that are starting to challenge this notion because we suddenly have a lot more archaeological data of a different nature than we had before. So you're right that like if we only excavate things that we see on the surface, like stone houses, and we only get the funding to excavate the stone houses, then we're not gonna maybe find the rest of the population. And that is a fact. So like until 1990, that was really most of what we had. People went out trying to find rural populations, but they got funding to excavate villas. That's what they excavated, just villas. So they're ignoring and not finding everything that's below the level of the villa. Does that make sense? Now, across Europe, since the 90s, laws have been put in place requiring excavation of everywhere where building is going to happen, which is like taking a random sample of everything under the ground in all of England, right? Because people are building everywhere. Obviously, there are places where people are building more now. So those places have a wider, better sample than places where people aren't building anything. But what we're basically getting now, and I'll show you, well, I'll come back to the Roman literature in a second. I just want to show you the map. I showed you this map last time. This is excavations over time in England every 10 years. So it moves really slowly in the beginning. You can see not very much excavation in the 1800s, but still some. Stuff that's being excavated in this period is mainly villas, Roman baths, Roman towns. This is just Roman stuff. But you can see in 1990, when this law goes into effect, watch for it now. So people are excavating now in everywhere, even where they don't think that there's any archaeological remains, okay? And what we find of wooden buildings is it's really clear that it's a building, right? You see here, it's hard to see it if you're not an archaeologist, so I'll translate for you, okay? This is what's called an enclosure. Do you see this kind of, yeah. An enclosure, so like a fenced in area or a ditched in area. You might dig a ditch just to demarcate your territory, where your home is going to be, maybe to keep animals out or to keep animals in, okay? So this shows up in the soil profile. And then you see the circular buildings. These are round houses. So the kind of wooden wattle and daub houses that were made in the Iron Age and early Roman period, yep. So when wood decays in the ground, it's gonna stain the color of the soil. And in some places it does it in a more visible way than in others. I have excavated in Greece where it's so dry that you really can't see the wooden impressions as well. If you're here in England, it's really, really easy to see them. It's wet enough that it really the wood will really rot in before as it's decaying in a way that it makes a very, very visible stain in the soil. So we can see tons of wood impressions, and we're going to look more at wooden buildings in a minute. Yep. Fires, even things like, okay, when people were buried in the late Iron Age and early Roman period, they'd be cremated, and then they'd either be put in an urn or they would just be put in the ground, right? And in the Bronze Age in particular, people were put in the ground without an urn. And archaeologists routinely find these unurned cremation burials. Are you raising your hand? No. Okay. Here you can see some straighter. Some of these are trenches, and some of them, though, are impressions of rectilinear buildings. You can see here, do you see this like row of post holes here? And one here. So that's a rectilinear, like a rectangular wooden building. Yeah. Ditches with trash in them. So these ditches always have trash in them. Yeah. Lots and lots of trash. So just going back really quick. What we know from the medieval literature has affected what we assume we're going to find when we look archaeologically at the Roman material. But if we were to look at the Roman literature, we find something that's a little bit different, okay? We find stereotypes. They're different stereotypes, which is interesting. And we find information that I think corresponds with what we see in images of medieval peasants, but not with what we hear about them, okay? So they lived in small houses, villulae. vilulae, not huts, but vilulae, little villas. They owned a slave or two. They lived, these houses might have 2 or 3 stories. We find out about this from like little references. So-and-so was was escaping through the countryside and they had to stay at this peasant's house and they stayed in the attic, right? They bought from taverns and shops. They went to the market to buy and sell. They worried about making a profit. So the main stereotype about peasants, one of the main ones in the Roman world, is that they're really bad conversationalists. They're really boring. You wouldn't want to go stay at the house of your peasant friend. You know, you wouldn't want to have dinner with them because they're just going to talk about the grain prices and how much they're going to sell their crop for. They're not going to be messing around with the ladies, doing things that they shouldn't be doing like you are, right? They're not as cultured, meaning that they're not going to want to talk about high-end literature, poetry. Instead, they're going to want to talk about making money, right? This is not the same thing as people living at subsistence and being economically irrational. It is a negative stereotype, but and it may be true, right? But in any case, it's a different stereotype than the one that I was born into, the one that I had. Anyway, okay, so I tried to come up with a project design that would allow me to kind of answer some of these questions and meet the critiques of people like Walter Scheidel, whose quote I showed you, that will say you can't find non-elite people in the archaeological record. And I think I've been successful, but we'll see when I publish the book, if somebody like Walter Scheidel writes saying, you know, he probably will write something terrible about it, but everyone else that I've showed it to likes it. So yeah.
A while back, you used the example of 18th century Ireland
Mhm.
and Irish peasants. And during that time, they were an occupied country.
Exactly.
And the life of the Irish was very different from the Anglo-Irish.
Yeah.
In the same country. And it was actually against the law to teach Irish people to educate them.
Yeah.
So you're talking about Britain, and that also would have been an occupied country.
Exactly. Mhm.
So how does being an occupied force and the peasant culture, how does that variable influence?
I will, if I don't explicitly mention it, remind me, because I have several slides about this. Okay, because we see it very clearly in the archaeological record. We see some evidence of the huge amount of destruction that happens when the Romans come in. What happens after that? We'll see.
You covered this already, but did the Romans then send up some of their wealthy people to run these villas and bring in the local peasants to be their labor?
Well, we'll get there. Again, let me get to the Roman conquest of Britain in a second, okay? So, okay, I'm just going to tell you about the project first, and then we'll answer these. These are really, really good questions. So I thought I would work with this kind of data that other people have already excavated. So some people, when they're doing a dissertation, they do their excavation, then they only have one site. I thought I would work with excavations that have already been done so I could use lots of sites, right? I got really lucky that right as I was starting my project, a database was being published of excavations of rural sites in Britain, okay? So it just happened that way. I was extremely, extremely fortunate. So I could access the site reports, because a lot of the time in England, and like now when I go back this summer, I'm going to have to drive around to different county records offices, getting the new records that are not in this, because this stopped being updated in 2013. But they published it in 2015, but only up to 2013 is included in here. So I have my work cut out for me. But at the time when I was working on this, this was the most up-to-date information that existed. So I could use it. And what I did was use landscape level archaeological data. So looking at whole micro regions, trying to say like, what's in this region? How many excavations are there? What have they found? What's at the top of the settlement hierarchy in this region? What's at the bottom? What kind of sites are at the top? What kind of sites are at the bottom? And then what can research into these sites tell us about lives on the farms that we're looking at. And I've done, you know, a dissertation on it, and as I'm working on the book, there are things that I'm going to add to this. So looking in more depth at certain questions that I didn't have time to look at while I was doing the dissertation. So looking at things like settlement patterns, the use of the environment, production, use of technology, right? Use of the landscape, patterns of consumption. That's a main thing that it's really easy to look at pottery, things like that. It's harder to say this farm, you can't say this house here owned or used this land around here. We can't prove that unless we have like ownership records, tenancy agreement. But what we can say is the people in this house had this kind of pottery. They used this kind of clothing pins. They had this kind of furniture. They had furniture, right? So that was something that I focused on and that I'm still focusing on as I work on the book. I looked at 4 case study areas. I don't know, this symbol didn't make it when I sent it, but in any case, this was supposed to be an arrow. 4 case study areas based around large excavations. So excavations that did stripping of the landscape, that dug away everything that was there, showing those images of what was beneath the soil. So I said, like, this is going to be my baseline of what's found in this region. These huge open area excavations, like the excavation of Heathrow Terminal 5, the excavation of the Channel Tunnel rail link, stretching all the way from almost London, south of London, east of London, sorry, all the way down to the coast. And then the fens, this is what we're going to be talking about. This is a wetland environment around the town of Cambridge. What you do when you look at a lot of data at a time is you have to categorize it, which is not something that I had ever thought about until I started. And that was fun. Not fun. I had 185 discrete categories for the sites themselves, their morphology, their dates, and then the things found on the site. Yeah, I know. I know. I had to do something free because I didn't have access to, yeah. Oxford is like not the place to go if you want a lot of free software. Just, well, and we've already talked about the research folks. There are a lot of pros and cons to working with this kind of data. So the pros might be you can access a lot of data, you can do it quickly, and it's free. The cons are people have done these excavations over about 200 years, so I wasn't excluding anything. I used everything that was available, which means that some people, 200 years ago, they called a certain kind of pottery something different than they call it now. And I don't know what we can't tell is this pottery that they called this thing in 1800 the same as this pottery that we call a different thing now. I didn't have the resources or the time to go from, county record office to county record office, like finding old boxes of pottery and comparing them. Many of the newer ones, they're done, the way that people get their, get funding to do these excavations is it's companies that have to bid, and the company goes with the company that's doing the building project will choose the archaeological company that's giving them the lowest bid, right? So the low bidding companies, sometimes they're not very good at publishing their data, and they might publish a 7-page report on a large site and not include a ceramics report in it, or no animal bone report, or no environmental report, or no report at all, just a page saying we found a house, right? Really irritating. So this is the thing, this is the problem with working with this kind of data, is it's very, very frustrating, and it'll leave you talking to yourself like every day about things like this. Many of the questions that you might have if you were doing an excavation yourself, you can't answer because it's somebody else's excavation and that person has died, or they've forgotten what they worked on 50 years ago. And so you send them an email and they don't respond, or they say, I don't actually know, right? So in any case, do we have time to do you guys want to do this mapping exercise for 1 minute? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We could let's just not do the mapping exercise, right? We'll come back to it if we have time.
In my experience, I'm not sure you're this dating that there's this old view of peasants and now it's changing.
Mhm.
So Hadrian's Wall, that
Yeah.
was born in Pons Alias and lived until 2016 in various places.
Okay,
And I would drive from Corstopiton, Corbridge to
Yeah.
Newcastle.
amazing.
And the image we got was you had this established structure just growing up, not literature, of Iron Age tribes that were structurally sound and functional. The
Mhm.
Romans came in, they couldn't subjugate the locals, so the wall was not like a Trump wall. It was more like it is more like a customs post, and the trade was going on. And we would as kids try and just go digging for stuff. My girls were Latin is taught in high schools.
Yeah.
Not because of scholars, just because it's a useful, interesting thing if you live along the wall.
Yeah.
So it's a surprise to me that you have this, what feels like an old-fashioned view that we just grew up with, that they were just locals. They weren't, they were tribes, not peasants in a bad way.
Well, and that's like, okay, in the north of England, I think it's different than in the south. In terms of what's actually going on the ground for the Romans and the local people, and also in terms of what the theories are. And I actually disagree. I think that scholarship is moving in a different direction to the thing about the customs wall. This is just, I might be wrong, okay, but the wall, it has like a gigantic, the vallum on the one side, and then the huge ditch on the other side that's full of spiky wooden logs, right? And there are a lot of troops posted along this wall. So it's used as a customs post and for defense. But yes, they're completely unsuccessful keeping the local population in check. And they try very, very hard. Because they make the Hadrian's Wall, and then they make another wall, and then they go back to Hadrian's Wall, and then they leave, right? And the Romans leave Britain before they leave any of the other provinces except for Romania, because they just can't deal with it anymore. So what's going on up there, I think we don't think that the Roman economy reaches that far north, actually. So when we do excavations, a lot of the roundhouses don't have pottery, where in the south, all of the roundhouses do have pottery. So it seems like there's major cultural differences within England itself. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. They weren't talking about the local population, but they were buying things from the local population all the time. And this is one of the things that makes me so mad reading the scholarship that I have been talking about, that we say like all of the documentary evidence that we actually have from the Roman world indicates that the local populations, wherever the Romans are engaging with them economically and also socially, right? So there's no reason to think that these old tired theories would be true, right? Actually, all of our ancient evidence points in a different direction. But people still don't agree and believe it. Did that answer the question? Sort of. I'm just looking at the clock. So what I'm going to say, well, you already know that I think all these things, okay? But I'm just putting it out here. Rural populations can be located using current archaeological methods. Rural populations use the local landscape and environment to produce for the market, and they consumed heavily from market. And I'm not talking about Northern England here because I don't know what happened there. I've heard different, but rural settlement landscapes are highly variegated in terms of farm production, size, and architectural elaboration. And that models that assume that the Roman rural economy was a peasant economy, AKA just subsistence economy, need to be reevaluated. That's my argument in my thesis and my argument in my book. Now, for those of you that don't know anything about Roman Britain, Britain was invaded by the Romans for the first time under Julius Caesar in BC 55 and 54, okay? And he didn't stay. He was very unsuccessful. And then in AD 43, so a little bit less than 100 years later, the Roman Emperor Claudius launched an invasion from France that rolled up to the north. And this is a map showing Romanization. So how Roman culturally were the people of Britain. This is not my own map. This is somebody else's opinion, but just showing you that there's different timing of the cultural change that happened in Britain. And it reaches in not throughout the whole country. So we don't see much evidence of Romans in any way in Wales or in the southwest or in the north, right? So we see lots of Roman stuff, lots of Latin writing, lots of things like that. And we see the same things up here too, but not as widely as we see down here. Going to talk to you about this revolt because it figures into some of my research. So Britain becomes a Roman province, but it happens slowly. So some of the regions seem to have been client kingdoms in the beginning. In AD 60 to 61, the queen of the Iceni, located, can you see it if I use this here? She's beaten and her daughters are assaulted. And she launches a revolt with several other neighboring tribes. And they moved south, destroying 3 of the Roman towns, St. Albans, Colchester, and London. This is a map of the destruction deposits in London. So these forces burned London, Colchester, and St. Albans to the ground. Here you can see an image, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. So there was a large battle in AD 61 that Boudica lost. And she kind of disappears from history. The idea, different ancient Roman historians say different things about what happened to her. Either she was killed or she committed suicide. And that was the end of the independence of Britain until the Romans leave in 410. Okay. Now we've seen this already. It's just another slide saying the same thing. Here's my funny slide. We really do this. So I'm going to give you a case study of the Roman fens. Okay. I chose to look at the fens because it's a marginal landscape. It's known for having been poorer in the Roman period, but also in the more modern era. It's a 1,500 square mile region in the sort of the southeast, kind of mid-east, fed by many rivers and by the North Sea. It's a wetland landscape, so meres, bogs, lakes, marshes, fens, and water meadows in this kind of the greeny, bluey section there, with uplands, clay, uplands all around it. It's very, very prone to flooding, and it's been drained in a way that's very similar to the way that the Dutch landscape was drained, starting in the 1700s, but picking up steam in the 18 and 1900s. And there are windmills there and stuff like that. They actually brought in Dutch engineers to teach them how to do it. In any case, so now it doesn't look like a wetland anymore, but I did, travel around there a lot and have some pictures, my own and other people's pictures, showing you what the wetlands looked like in the Roman period. This is flooding today. Here are what the uplands look like. Yeah, that's a medieval fort. So I looked at about 350 sites here, okay? And here's a map of all of the sites combined. And one of the things that you see if you look at this map is that they're clustered in certain specific clusters. You can do a mathematical model of it to prove it, although you don't really need to. You can just see it with your eye. I did the mathematical model because, I don't know, it was my dissertation. One of the things that people have long thought is that this clustering is a cultural relic from Iron Age landholding patterns, so that people may have owned land in kinship groups. So you would live around common grazing land. And so one of the arguments that people have made is, well, this is from this is a map of the Roman period in the fens, this one here. So we can see the persistence of Iron Age landholding patterns in the fens in a way that we can't see elsewhere, is the argument. And I thought that was really interesting and I wanted it to be true. So I thought about it a lot. And then I made this map showing the water level where it floods in the Roman period, where it would have flooded, and where it would have been dry. Okay, I had to hand make my color ramp. It actually, this is a shortened version. It's a 250 color ramp. Okay, showing you the blue is well below sea level. The greenish is around sea level, still flood. The yellow is the zone where it stops flooding. So yellow or above, it usually won't flood unless it's a really, really bad year. Okay. And if you look at this map superimposed on this map, what do you see? Yeah. So not to say that there isn't also an ancestral landholding pattern at work here, but I don't think that we can tell that from looking at the maps. Okay. This is one of the little nitpicky things that I did in my dissertation that it took like 3 weeks to figure it out. And then I was like, oh, okay, it's just one sentence in the dissertation, but this is what you have to do. In any case, whether or not how people are actually dealing with land ownership in this period, we don't really know. What we know is that in the late Iron Age, we do have this landscape divided into tribal territories. You see the big circles, these are central places, different kinds of central places, some hill forts, although there aren't very many hills in the fen. So sometimes the hill forts are just on the ground, but fortified area. Some villages, larger villages where they're minting coins, and some big agglomerations of, 10 to 15 houses at a time. And then lots of individual small farms. So just some images of this. This is one of the hill forts. Site where they're minting coins. And one of these farmsteads, okay, with the enclosure and the circles of the houses. Now, the people that study this period will say there isn't very much change when the Romans come. We see a great continuity. And that in some ways that's true. But I would say in a lot of ways, it's actually really not true as well. There's truth and untruth there. We see a continuity when we look at the Iron Age versus the earliest Roman period. We see continuity of occupation on many farms, not all farms, but many farms. You can see continuity here on the farms, on about 40% of the farms. We see abandonment of 32% of the sites in total in the first 50 years after the Roman conquest. We see a change of occupation on another 26% of the sites. Change meaning the central place in the Iron Age, the fort or the town, has a Roman garrison put right on top. This is seen by many archaeologists as a sign of continuity. I would say that's not it's not a continuity that I would have wanted if I were somebody living there. So I'm going to call it change. And we see the imposition, or maybe to use a less political term, like the creation of a new infrastructure. So new roads being built, forts being built where there weren't forts at all or no central places at all, towns being built, walls being put in, okay? So we see, this is what I mean about, this is a landscape of conquest, and a landscape where we can see, particularly in certain regions, all of the farms in a certain region being abandoned. In certain really, really small micro regions, and we don't really know why. This is something that I did another project on when I was in my master's program in France. And it seems to be the case that it's possible anyway, that when the Romans take over a region, some of the land is given to Roman settlers. And those people that lived on that land may be made homeless, right? We don't really know. We don't quite understand the mechanisms of this yet, because our literature doesn't talk about as fine-grained sort of discussion about these things as we want. If we look at the material from the fen, and I'm rushing because we only have 20 minutes left, we'll see an expansion of the settlement hierarchy. So if we go back to here, we see small farms, villages, hill forts, and little towns, oppida, okay? So 4 things. If we look at the same region in the 2nd century, even in the, from between 100 to 200 AD, we'll see a bigger variety of these we call them higher order settlements, meaning more people living together. So, or nucleated settlements, lots of houses together. We see towns and forts, settlements along the roadside, so villages that are there primarily for trade purposes. Smaller villages and hamlets out in the countryside. And then we see a big variety of lower order, so single houses or just a couple houses together. We see villas, we see farms with certain kinds of architecture, some large aisled halls, some smaller rectilinear farm buildings, some round houses like the traditional ones that we have seen from the Iron Age. They tend to disappear by the 2nd century, but there still are some. This is something that doesn't happen in the north of England. People continue living in round houses for a very long time. Here in the south, they seem to die out by the 2nd century on almost every site. What do the nucleated settlements look like? Well, there are different kinds. This is a town. This is the town of Water-Newton today, Duro-Brioi in the Roman period. You can see it's a walled town with a big main street. Hasn't been fully excavated. So this is what scholars that work on this have made this map, trying to put together the results of many, many different excavations over many years. So there seem to be public buildings somewhere in the middle, lots of gates, lots of private houses. This, on the other hand, is a small village. It's out in the sort of in the wetland part of the fen. Here, just town here. Called Campground. It's a site of campground. This is the 3rd phase. We can see across all phases, this is a small village. Across all phases, there are 7 circular buildings, 52 rectangular ones. 2005 coins were found in the excavations. More were found by metal detectors around the site. 73,000 sherds of pottery were found. Pottery from all over the Roman world, including from Egypt, North Africa, Greece, Italy. Mostly coming from the local region though, and partly coming from France. So mostly from France and the local region, some from further afield. There were 98 lead fishing net weights and so many 42,000 fragments of fish bone, freshwater fish bone and animal bone, making the scholars think that this is a location for the salting of fish and the creation of like the condiment of choice in the Roman world is called garum, salted fish product that supposedly tasted a little bit like Thai fish sauce. I have never had the guts to try it. I have friends that make it, and every time I'm like, not doing it. So this is a kind of a local, regional center for production and also consumption of things that come from further afield, okay? We don't know what the population would have been. Somewhere, because we're not quite sure exactly when, whether or not all of the buildings were in use for habitation or whether some of them were storage buildings. If we look at the non-nucleated settlements, we see, again, this big variety of different kinds of architecture, villas, non-villa farms, what we call aisled halls, rectilinear timber structures, and roundhouses. So villas, this is what the plans look like. It's a little bit hard to see them, so I've just included this reconstruction. This is one of the larger villas around the Cambridgeshire region near Peterborough. Really, really large, very elaborately decorated villa. It's been partially excavated, still being excavated now. Most of our evidence, though, in the fens is of timber buildings, like this one. This comes from an excavation in Niles, Michigan, so obviously not of a Roman site, of a French fur trading settlement, okay? And it shows you that some of the time when people are building a wooden timber framed house, they put the timber straight into the ground like this, so you get post holes. And someday they're gonna excavate it. After this disintegrates, decays, they're gonna excavate it and see what they find, okay? Other times they put the uprights into what is often called a sill beam. So sometimes we just find a weird little scoop across the ground, and we can still find them this way, but they're not going to look like post holes in the ground. They're harder to find. And if you use a machine to go over it, like, which is often what we do in excavation, we strip the topsoil off and you're not paying attention and you go like an inch too far, it's totally lost. This is something that, the kind of thing that kept me up at night when I was working on my dissertation. I would think like, what if all of these farms have disappeared? Something that's really easy to find archaeologically, so we have a lot of them, are aisled halls, because they have these huge post holes because they're very, very large buildings. Sometimes with masonry foundation, sometimes just of wood. They're reconstructed in extremely different ways by artists. Sometimes they seem to be like mini villas. Sometimes people reconstruct them as looking like this. What's interesting about the aisled halls in the fens is that they're found in association with certain specific kinds of evidence, particularly weights. For when you're selling something or weighing something, purchasing something, you need weights to be able to show how much you have. Okay, so lots of weight, lots of writing implements, and seal boxes for when you're sending a letter and you need to seal it. Right? So things that are found predominantly on aisled buildings and not really anywhere else in the fens except for villas and towns. So these aisled buildings, they seem to be something in between a villa and a regular farm where we don't find stuff like this. And are they being used to administer this landscape? I don't know yet. I'm still thinking about it. The bulk of the evidence that we have comes from smaller sized structures made out of timber. This is what the plans look like, a little bit hard to see. This is what a reconstruction of a medieval one with a similar plan and a reconstruction of a Roman one. So mostly farmhouses like this, okay? Here we can see, if we look at the two maps from the Iron Age, from the Roman period, we can see lots of little farms spreading out. The other thing that we see spreading out that's harder to see, I think, is the tiny little dots. You see them? These tiny little dots are sites that are not domestic sites. Any site that's not a domestic site, I said it was peripheral to a domestic site, or non-domestic. And what we see in the Roman period is a dramatic change in the number of non-settlement sites. And I'm going to tell you why that matters, okay? We see non-settlement sites spreading out into this land that's marginal, we might say. So landscapes that are underwater for most of the year. They suddenly have lots of non-settlement sites on them. We see what this is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of other people that work on this, is we see an expansion of production out into this marginal landscape. We see expanding use of the land for arable, so cultivation, and for pastoral uses. Heavy exploitation of wild resources. Expansion of craft production away from the house. And then a huge number of industrial installations. And I'm going to show you what that looks like on the map in a second. These are the ones that we have the most of in the fen. Salterns, kiln site, meat salting site, or tanneries, and crop processing facilities. So here, a map of the salterns dated to the Roman period. This is all of the salterns that are in the National Monuments Record database, dated to the Roman period. So some of them have been really well excavated and some of them not. Some of them were found in rescue excavations right as they were being inundated with water, like right in flooded landscapes. So they're not all well dated. So just in the Roman period in general. So huge expansion in the salt production capacity of this landscape. People seem to be going out away. There are no houses near most of these. So people seem to be maybe traveling, making salt for part of the year, living in maybe tents or something while they're doing that, and then going back home again. Yes.
To the fact that there were windmills and there was draining happening
In the medieval
What-
period.
in the medieval.
In the early modern
In
period.
this period, this was still land that flooded all the time.
So we have a question about this. So there's a big water work called the Car Dike This is the red thing here.
Okay.
And that may have acted as a drainage ditch, but probably didn't. Because of its position, it seems to be maybe preventing the landscape from getting more flooded than it already is. But it didn't seem to have the capacity to drain. Most of the people that work on it think that it didn't drain the whole landscape the way that the modern dikes do, but it may have drained it or prevented some of the flooding that happened. So maybe we wonder about this and fight about it a lot. People write really angry articles about it.
Very interesting.
I agree. This is pottery. Okay, so pottery kilns dated to the Roman period. Huge explosion of pottery production in this region. It's being exported all the way up to Hadrian's Wall, all the way across the country, not all the way out to the west, but almost all the way out to the west coast. And being used very, very widely by the people living in the region as well. Okay. So most people have pottery from local kilns as the most of the pottery that they're using. So let's look at everything together. We see a heavy use of the landscape for production of goods that we know are being sold in the market. We see a big variation in settlement type. So some small houses, some large houses, some round houses, very few round houses, some villas, some villages. I'm going to give you one example of this is my favorite site. I don't know why it's my favorite site, but it has always been, okay? It's called the Bluebell Land. It's a site. It's on the edge of the fens, so it can make use of the wild resources in the fens and also the upland. It has a big farm enclosure, a big field system. Maybe the main house has been excavated, maybe not, it's hard to tell. Doesn't seem to have been a villa site, whether we have the main house or not, because there's no elaborate building material from the site. The environmental data indicate a mixed farming regime, so they're farming spelt and emmer wheat, and they're also grazing animals in really large quantities, so really, really a lot of sheep bone found, or sheep goat is undistinguishable in the Roman period, so sheep goat. Lots of colanders and storage jars make the excavators think that they're making goat cheese or sheep cheese for sale in the market. Yeah. The finds from the site are interesting. So this is a smallish farm site, okay? One of the sort of an average farm site from this region, okay? Over 4,000 sherds of pottery from local mass production sites, and imported from beyond the region. So imported from around England, imported from France and Germany, and imported from Spain, just a little bit. Several coins, a toiletry set, so tweezers, and an ear scoop to get your earwax out. Some pins, and a bracelet with a snake head on either end, okay? And then interestingly, but not really important for the purposes of my argument, 11 leather shoes coming from the wells on the site, preserved because we're in such low ground. What does this say? How does this have anything to do with what we've been talking about, what we talked about at the beginning of the lecture? I think one of the things that I'm going to show you I'll fast forward through this for now. One of the things that we see in the fens and elsewhere is that all of the farm sites, whether they're more elaborately built or not, have access to material from outside the 5 miles right around the site. They're not making their pottery by hand. They're not buying their pottery from the neighbor next door. They're buying it from a mass production site with cash. They have a lot of pottery. They're not rich, so this must be cheap pottery, but they're making use of the market in a really dramatic way. Suddenly, from the late Iron Age on, 92% of the farms, so farms distinct from villas, 92% of the smaller farm sites have imported pottery coming from France on every single site in one of the case study areas, but in the low 90s in the rest of them. So it says something about the purchasing power of these farms. It says that maybe they're not intending only for subsistence. Maybe they're aiming at something at some kind of level of comfort. They're certainly not rich. They're living in wooden houses with wattle and daub walls, usually sometimes a stone floor, but usually a clay floor, where we have floors that survive. So, you get mud on your feet, but you still have a nice bracelet. You're still buying your pottery from a mass production site, okay? You might learn how to read and write a little bit. We find graffiti scratched into some of the pottery. So not poetry, not Homer, not Greek, but a little bit of Latin, Roman style names, sometimes names that are an amalgamation of a British name, Brittonic name, and a Roman name at the end. So here, my 4 points. I'm just rushing so that we have time for questions. I'm saying that excavations in recent decades have dramatically increased available data on rural life, and that the inhabitants of the marginal landscape of the fens use natural resources and available technologies like salt production and pottery production to produce things for themselves, but also for wider markets. That the variegated settlement pattern that we have with some big houses, a lot of medium-sized houses and a lot of small ones, show that we can't just put the rural population into this binary of the wealthy and the people living in huts. That the use of the market was absolutely ubiquitous across all of the regions that I looked at. People were buying necessary goods from the region and beyond the region on 100% of the site, right? That people were able to purchase minor luxury goods, not expensive things, but things that were a little bit more expensive on 92% of the farm site. And that about half of the sites had access to things that were even more expensive and luxurious. Farms, not villas. This makes me think that we need to re-theorize what life in the countryside was like in the Roman period. And what I'll say is that instead of having this as our model in our mind, we might assume something more like this. So not just haves and have-nots, but certainly haves, people that have a lot, and people that have less, but on a sliding scale. More like what we have in the modern world, actually. Although obviously at a much lower level of comfort than we have now. So to summarize, okay, our economic models show that 70 to 90% of the rural population lived in the countryside. And we know that they're producing huge surpluses, partly because they're producing for these cities that we looked at in the first day, right? They're producing everything that the people in the cities are using. And that 70 to 90% of the population is engaged in that production, and they're selling their stuff some of the time. Some of the time they're giving it as taxes, other times selling it. We know that local people are using local knowledge to do this. We don't think that it's Romans, Italians coming in, partly because we have DNA evidence from England that doesn't seem to indicate any kind of large population of incoming Mediterranean blood. Partly because the few DNA studies that have been done of this region show that not everybody, a lot of people come from the local region, okay? People are consuming mostly low-cost goods, okay? But in the aggregate, this is very, very high volume trade, okay? So they are the market for all the mass production that we're seeing, right? So we often will say like, oh, we see all of this huge production, but the peasants were still really poor. The peasants were living at subsistence. Well, who are you selling the stuff to? You're selling the stuff to the people that are making this, people are making things and selling it to other people who are making things. I'm saying that as both producers and consumers, the rural populations in the Roman world were crucial to the functioning of the economy. And they were an engine of economic growth in the Roman world, just as the cities were, cities and countryside. That is my argument. Now I will take more questions if you have them. Yes.
Of all of those archaeological sites in Britain, are they mostly unoccupied land? Or are some of them where you have present day structures and, every time somebody digs to build a new structure, there's probably some contamination, so.
Exactly. So it's hard. So we have a lot of really good evidence from the Iron Age and the early Roman period. When we get to the later Roman period, like especially in the farmland, people plowed. And oftentimes we'll actually find like ruts from plows in the floors, even of things like a villa. So we don't know what's happened then to the timber structures. Some of them survive and some of them are what we call truncated. So they were there and now the ground level's lower, so we don't have them anymore. It's a problem.
This is kind of a mundane question, but I was jarred by the idea that they didn't have any jars. I mean, there was no pottery before the Romans in.
Oh, there was.
Britain?
There was tons of pottery, but in the north of England, they don't have a culture that uses ceramics very much. Like they never did. So in the Iron Age and in the Roman period, most of the settlements don't have pottery. In the south, they seem to have always had a culture of using pottery, and they had pottery and they started mass producing. So if we go back to this slide, some of this trade begins before the Romans come, and some of the mass production sites start before the Romans come, which is really interesting. And I think indicates something about changes in the culture. This is what I'm saying about consumption. People start wanting to consume mass-produced goods before the Romans get there. And they continue wanting to consume mass-produced goods after the Romans are there as well.
The Romans had a fort, I believe, in Exeter, which is going west. And through Devon and Cornwall, they did a lot of mining, tin mining,
Yeah.
but that didn't happen while the Romans were there, or the Romans didn't know
It
about
It did happen while the Romans were there.
it. It did.
As far as I know, this is not my specialty, but I have a friend that works on tin mining in the Roman period and talks about this. But what's really weird, and there is Roman stuff in that area, lots of
There
Roman
has
stuff,
to be.
but
because
it's not as well, there are whole areas that aren't very well excavated. So do we know, or that haven't been excavated as intensively recently?
And they had a stannery towns.
What?
Stannery towns where they would bring the tin.
Yeah, and but I mean, this is something that I'm not looking at that region because it would require me to learn a whole different kind of pottery. So maybe for future research.
So I'm going to interrupt just slightly because sometimes I've let discussion go long and people go to me to shut it.
Yeah,
If you need to go, it's past 11 and you need to go, want to go ahead, and then you can either talk to Maggie personally or we can continue a discussion.
I'm gonna leave, but I got a quick comment, I guess. I'm watching this and going, what's what I say really changed? We have the have-nots, we have the haves,
mhm,
we do importing, we do exporting, we have et cetera, et cetera. We have this kind of product, now this kind of product, we have mass production. I'm kind of sitting there thinking, gee, my world really hasn't changed back from.
right.
Is
I
that
would agree.
is that a decent comment or?
Oh, I think it's completely true.
Okay.
And I mean, this is something that it's weird that there's a whole debate in the study of the Roman economy with primitivists versus modernists. So somebody like Walter Scheidel would say, oh, you're wrong. The Romans have a primitive economy. So, but I mean, I obviously don't fall into the Walter Scheidel camp. So I think that you're totally, I mean, I think that obviously we all know like technology is different now, so we can do things differently than we did 2000 years ago. But I think human nature hasn't changed, right? So humans want to live as comfortably as they can. And yeah, people are people. Exactly. Yeah.
Could you put up the have and have not slide again?
Mhm.
And that's a preface to my comment. The
This
first
one?
piece, yeah, if you'd leave that up for a second. The first piece that you've helped me overcome bias on is I have a friend who is definitely country, definitely out there.
Mhm.
And I always wondered why is he an exception to policy? Because he's literate. He likes studying the etymology of words, where they come from and why. He's really into this sort of thing. And I had the prejudice that, well, they're country bumpkins sort of thing. And we keep that banter going because we're good friends and I get away with it, but you've helped me recognize this in a different way. Number two, the profound thing that you've helped me differently understand is a concept that our other friend was talking about with the haves and have-nots. The first thing that comes to mind is the movie Titanic. And the
Mhm.
first class, snooty and obnoxious and putting on facades and had a lot of money. And then the peasants, if you will, in steerage. And when the rich girl who couldn't stand the rich people went to dance with the people down below, they're having fun.
Oh, yeah.
And so this was an interesting construct. It's not this have nots, it's just have lesser. And maybe, I don't know this, maybe you're more real when you're peasant than when you're snot.
Yeah. I would certainly agree with that.
All
Good
right.
comment. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, do you have a question? Yeah, sure.
I mean, a fascinating, insightful discussion. And I'm just interested, you said the old image of Hadrian's Wall as a kind of wall
Uh-huh.
changed to be more of a customs for all this trade, which is where I got to. But you say it's now changed again, or it's starting to change into what?
Into again, like a both, kind of like this. We'll say, yes, we have haves and we also have all these other things. I would say in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, people were really trying to say, look, like it's not all just the Romans in power and the Britons, just the colonialized people with no agency, right? They have agency. And that's true. They do have agency. It's also true that the Romans were in power and the Romans were an extremely violent occupying force in the north of England. Thank you. And they used the force as often as necessary. So we see elsewhere in the Roman world, they destroy whole cities when they're mad at people, right? Enslaving everybody or killing them. So we know it's a similar situation in England. And we see in the north of Britain, a huge investment in the defensive purposes capacity of the wall, in addition to an investment in all of these different customs doors, right? So we know they're using it for dual purposes. So it's not saying that what you were taught is wrong, but saying that has to be kind of married up with a memory of the more violent side of the Roman conquest as well. And that we, it's easy to kind of to romanticize the Romans and to say, oh, well, they really weren't that bad, or, they were bad, but our people also fought them really well. And that's true. And it's also necessary just to remember that, one of the things that we see is that area seems to be very economically backward. It doesn't develop economically the way that the rest of Britain does. And why is that? That might be because people are being treated in a worse way. Like people living around the soldiers, maybe some of them may be able to engage economically with the soldiers, and others of them people might not want to live right around the fort. We don't see a lot of, whether or not this is a problem with excavation or not, we don't see a lot of newly excavated farmhouses right around the fortifications, right? So this is something, do you know David Mattingly? Know of David Mattingly? He wrote a great book on this, talking about the impact of Roman, looking at modern occupying forces and saying, here are some of the things that happen in colonial situations in the more modern world where we have more data. Let's assume that some of these may have happened in the Roman period and try to imagine what that would have been like up on Hadrian's Wall or anywhere where Romans are starting to come in, and saying, we need to never forget the underbelly of all of this. And so that, I think, is how things have changed. I think we've kind of come towards the middle of we have an understanding that yes, they're very powerful and very violent, and also the local people resisted in powerful and important ways. So kind of in the middle. Does that answer the question? Okay, we can talk about it more.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everybody.